August 1945. The air over southern Kyushu hangs thick with late summer humidity. The war has ended, at least on paper. The emperor's voice has already echoed through crackling radios announcing surrender. But for many Japanese civilians, fear has not surrendered with it. A small group approaches a newly established American military camp on the edge of a ruined town. They walk slowly, hesitantly. Mothers clutch children. An elderly man keeps his eyes lowered. They have been told for years that the Americans are devils. That capture means humiliation, torture, death instead. What greets them is something entirely different. Rows of olive drab tents stand in precise lines. Trucks idle beside fuel drums. Electric cables snake across the ground. A generator hums steadily. The smell drifting through the air is not smoke or blood, but coffee. Fresh bread. Canned meat warming in metal trays. An American medic kneels too. Examine a wounded child. No one is. Shouting, no one is beating prisoners. The civilians stare in stunned silence, because everything they had been prepared to see is missing. But to understand why this moment felt so impossible, we must go back to the world that shaped their fear. By 1945, Japan was no longer fighting a distant war. The war had come home. For nearly 15 years, the Japanese Empire had expanded across East Asia and the Pacific, from Manchuria in 1931 to China in 1937, to the sweeping offensives that followed Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Early victories had created the image of invincibility. Newspapers spoke of destiny. Radio broadcasts praised sacrifice. School children were taught that the emperor was divine. The nation was sacred. But by 1944, the tide had shifted. The fall of Saipan in June 1944 marked a psychological rupture. The islands captured by American forces placed the Japanese home islands within range of US B-29 bombers. For civilians, the battle carried another darker memory. As American troops advanced, hundreds of Japanese civilians, terrified by rumors of torture and mutilation, leapt from cliffs at Marpy Point. Entire families jumped together. Mothers carried infants. Soldiers and civilians alike had been told that surrender was worse than death. Those fears were not spontaneous. They had been cultivated Japanese. Wartime propaganda consistently portrayed Americans as barbaric. Posters depicted demonic caricatures. Newspapers described alleged atrocities. Military manuals instructed soldiers that capture was dishonor. Civilians were warned that invasion meant violation and slaughter. Stories from earlier Pacific battles were often distorted or amplified to reinforce this narrative. By early 1945, the bombing of Japanese cities intensified these fears. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, American B-29 bombers launched a devastating firebombing raid on Tokyo. The resulting inferno killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. Wooden homes burned uncontrollably. Families suffocated in shelters. Entire neighborhoods disappeared by dawn. For many civilians, the sky itself had become the enemy. Air raid sirens became part of daily life. Children were evacuated to rural areas. Food shortages worsened as shipping lanes were cut by American submarines. Rice rations shrank. Substitute foods, sweet potatoes, barley mixtures, even ground acorns became common. Urban infrastructure crumbled under sustained bombing, yet even as physical destruction mounted, the government maintained strict control over information. Radio broadcasts emphasized courage. Official statements framed setbacks as temporary. Citizens were urged to prepare for a final, decisive battle on the home islands. The phrase, 100 million shattered jewels, suggested collective sacrifice rather than surrender. Then came Okinawa, beginning in April 1945. American forces landed on the island in what became one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers would die, but the civilian toll was staggering. Historians estimate that between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians perished, many caught between armies. Others driven to suicide by fear of American capture. Witnesses later recalled soldiers distributing grenades to families. Some civilians were told that Americans would rape women and torture children. Others hid in caves for weeks, starving, listening to artillery thunder overhead. This was the psychological landscape of 1945 Japan. Fear was not abstract. It was reinforced by bombing raids, battlefield rumors, and official doctrine. Civilians had been conditioned to expect annihilation if American troops reached their towns. Surrender was betrayal. Capture was humiliation. Survival under occupation seemed unimaginable. Even in August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war, uncertainty persisted. The Emperor's surrender announcement on August 15th was formal, distant, delivered in archaic language many struggled to fully understand. It declared the end of hostilities, but not the end of fear. People whispered in alleyways. Would American soldiers begin executions? Would women be taken? Would food be seized? Would Japan cease to exist entirely? And so, when civilians first approached American camps in those final weeks of 1945, they carried more than hunger and exhaustion. They carried years of indoctrinated terror. But across the Pacific, a very different system had been preparing for this moment. I'm built not on myth or mysticism, but on industrial scale, logistical planning, and calculated occupation policy. While Japanese civilians prepared for annihilation, the United States had been preparing for administration. The American war effort in the Pacific was not only military, it was industrial. By 1945, the United States had mobilized a logistical machine unmatched in history. Shipyards on the West Coast launched vessels at astonishing speed. Liberty ships mass-produced cargo carriers crossed the Pacific in steady convoys. Tankers delivered fuel. Refrigerated ships carried meat and medical supplies. Floating dry docks repaired damaged. Warships near the front, behind every rifleman, was a supply chain stretching thousands of miles. American military camps reflected this system. They were not improvised encampments of desperation. They were standardized environments designed for efficiency, hygiene, and sustainability. Engineers surveyed terrain before construction. Tents were aligned in geometric rows. Latrines were dug at regulated distances from kitchens. Water purification units operated continuously. Electrical generators provided light after sunset. Field kitchens produced hot meals daily. Medical tents functioned with antiseptics, sulfa drugs, plasma transfusions. Mobile surgical units could be assembled within hours. Engineers installed refrigeration units capable of storing fresh food in tropical climates. Even on remote islands, American troops often had access to canned fruit, powdered milk, and cigarettes shipped from across the ocean. This was not luxury. It was policy. By 1945, us planners were already preparing for occupation. Psychological warfare units printed millions of leaflets in Japanese. These leaflets promised humane treatment, medical care, and food for those who surrendered. Loudspeaker teams broadcast similar messages during battles like Okinawa. Some civilians ignored them. Others were too frightened to believe them. Yet the policies were real. American occupation directives emphasized discipline. Troops were instructed that mistreatment of civilians would be punished. Commanders understood that stability required restraint. The war had been brutalist, especially in the Pacific, but occupation demanded order. There was also diversity within the American ranks. By 1945, the U.S. military included African American units, Japanese American soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, Native American code talkers, and immigrant servicemen. For many Japanese civilians, in a rigidly stratified society, the sight of racially diverse soldiers wearing the same uniform was unfamiliar. Equally unfamiliar was the visible abundance, even as Japan faced famine conditions in urban centers. American camps operated with steady rations. Standard daily rations for U.S. soldiers in 1945 averaged around 3,500 calories. Canned beef, Spam, powdered eggs, chocolate bars, coffee brewed in large metal containers, bread baked in mobile ovens. The contrast was stark. In bombed Japanese cities, civilians scavenged for scraps. Black markets thrived. Government distribution systems faltered under transportation collapse. Meanwhile, only a short distance away, American camps functioned with mechanical regularity. This contrast was not accidental. The United States had entered the war with vast industrial capacity and geographic insulation from invasion. Factories operated without fear of bombing. Rail networks remained intact. Oil flowed freely from domestic wells. The American homeland did not burn as Tokyo burned. By summer 1945, atomic bombs devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. American planners were already organizing the logistics of post-war governance. General Douglas MacArthur would soon oversee occupation headquarters in Tokyo. Civil affairs units prepared to assess infrastructure, distribute food, and restore public order. 4 Japanese civilians raised on images of American savagery. This reality would soon collide with expectation, because when the first frightened families crossed the perimeter of those camps, they did not encounter chaos. They encountered structure, and in that structure lay the first fracture in the psychological wall built over years of war. From this collision of fear and reality, multiple perspectives begin to emerge: human, technological, psychological, and moral. For many Japanese civilians, the first shock was not technological. It was human. They had expected shouting, violence, retribution instead. They were met with procedure. On Okinawa, in the summer of 1945, American forces established civilian collection points as the fighting moved north. Families emerged from caves thin, dehydrated, often wounded. Interpreters stood beside Marines and Army medics. Hands were raised not to strike but to signal calm. Food was distributed first. So rations were opened in front of civilians to demonstrate safety. Rice, when available, was prioritized for those unable to stomach canned meat. Water was poured into metal cups and passed carefully to children. Doctors examined injuries without demanding loyalty pledges or confessions. Those requiring surgery were transported to field hospitals. Many civilians hesitated before accepting help. Years of propaganda had warned them that Americans poisoned wells and mutilated captives. Some mothers initially refused medical treatment for fear their children would be taken away. But hunger and exhaustion overcame suspicion. What followed was often quiet disbelief. Witnesses later described the silence in those early encounters. Civilians watched American soldiers joke among themselves, smoke cigarettes, write letters home. They saw men cleaning rifles methodically, not firing them indiscriminately. They saw guards who did not beat prisoners without cause. The absence of brutality felt disorienting. Even simple gestures, offering chocolate to a child, bandaging a wound, carried enormous psychological weight. These were not acts of charity alone. They were components of occupation discipline. Yet 2 civilians shaped by years of terror narratives. They appeared almost unreal. The war had taught them that the enemy was monstrous. The camp suggested something else, and that realization unsettled. Everything but the human shock was only the beginning, because beyond the behavior of individual soldiers stood something even more overwhelming: the machinery that surrounded them. If fear had prepared civilians for cruelty, nothing had prepared them for abundance. American camps were not merely orderly. They were industrial ecosystems. Generators hummed continuously, powering electric lights that burned steadily after sunset. In many Japanese towns, electricity had become unreliable or non-existent by 1945 due to bombing damage. Here inside the perimeter fence, bulbs glowed without flicker. Refrigeration units preserved meat in summer heat. Water purification systems transformed river water into drinkable supply within hours. Engineers operated bulldozers and graders to level ground, construct drainage systems, and erect prefabricated structures. Jeeps moved efficiently between tents. Trucks delivered crates stamped with dates and inventory numbers. For civilians accustomed to scarcity, the scale was astonishing. American supply lines delivered millions of tons of material across the Pacific. Ammunition, yes, but also flour, medical kits, spare parts, typewriters, radio equipment. The war for the United States had been fought with machines as much as men. Children stared at vehicles with open fascination. The Jeep Compact Versatile became an object of curiosity. Portable radios transmitted music from distant ships. Canned goods bore English labels in bold lettering. Even the fabric of uniforms appeared standardized and durable compared to the worn civilian clothing many Japanese now wore. This was not simply a difference in wealth, it was a difference in systems. Japan's wartime economy had been strained by blockade, resource shortages, and industrial targeting. By mid-1945, transportation networks were crippled. Coal production declined. Food shipments struggled to reach cities. Civilian infrastructure deteriorated under relentless bombing. The American camp, by contrast, functioned as if insulated from that collapse, to a population told that the enemy was chaotic and barbaric. This display of organization felt deeply unsettling. The devils they had imagined operated water pumps. They logged inventory. They followed schedules. The shock was not admiration. It was ricating, because in those rows of tents and humming machines lay proof that the war had not only been lost on the battlefield, it had been lost in production, in supply, in scale. And as civilians absorbed this realization, another fracture appeared, this time not in fear, but in belief. For years, the Japanese state had constructed a single image of the American enemy: brutal, decadent. Inhuman school textbooks reinforced it. Newspapers amplified it. Military briefings repeated it. Civilians were told that surrender meant torture, that women would be assaulted, that children would be Wyonet, the first encounters inside. American camps did not immediately erase these fears, but they weakened them. When civilians were processed through registration points, they were counted, not beaten. Names were recorded. Families were kept together whenever possible. Interpreters explained rules. Medical examinations were conducted systematically. There were fences and guards. Yes, but there was also predictability. Predictability undermines myth on Okinawa. Thousands of civilians were housed in temporary camps under American supervision. Conditions were crowded. Food was rationed. Disease remained a risk. This was not comfort. It was wartime containment. Yet reports from survivors consistently describe a gradual shift from terror to wary observation. Some civilians later admitted had hidden knives when first approaching American lines, prepared to defend themselves against imagined assault. When none came, confusion followed. The propaganda had not been entirely false. War in the Pacific had been savage. There were atrocities on both sides. Prisoners had died in brutal conditions. Cities had burned. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been annihilated in seconds. But inside these camps, the immediate expectation of random cruelty did not materialize, and that absence forced a quiet reckoning. Because when a system built on total war meets an occupying force practicing structured restraint, the narrative fractures, the enemy becomes human, and that transformation is psychologically destabilizing. Yet the story was not one-sided. Inside those same camps stood American soldiers carrying their own burdens, memories, shaped by years of brutal island fighting. By 1945, many American troops in the Pacific had endured campaigns defined by ferocity: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They had witnessed banzai, charges and civilians coerced into suicide. They had seen comrades killed in close combat. For some, resentment ran deep. Wartime propaganda in the United States had also dehumanized the Japanese enemy. Often in racialized terms, occupation policy demanded discipline. General orders emphasized that mistreatment of civilians would not be tolerated. Commanders understood that post-war stability required controlled behavior. Violations did occur, no army is without crime, but overall, occupation forces maintained structured conduct. Many soldiers were simply exhausted. The war was over. Survival had replaced vengeance as priority. Letters home shifted tone from battle reports to anticipation of return. Some troops expressed surprise at the condition of Japanese cities, entire districts reduced to ash. Others noted the thinness of civilians, the signs of malnutrition. Encounters were often cautious on both sides. Civilians bowed stiffly. Soldiers responded with nods. Cigarettes became a form of informal currency. Chocolate bars, originally ration items, were sometimes given to children, not from sentimentality alone, but from a mixture of relief and curiosity. The American camp became a space of suspended hostility. Weapons remained present. Guard towers overlooked perimeters. Yet daily interactions were governed by routine rather than rage. Engineers repaired roads. Medical officers treated infections. Military police enforced curfews. This contrast between battlefield brutality and occupation structure created a dual image of America in Japanese memory, which leads to the final and perhaps most complex angle of all too many civilians. The same nation that now offered food had also firebombed their cities. The same military that distributed medical aid had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. The shock inside American camps was therefore layered. It was not simple gratitude, it was contradiction. How could a force capable of such destruction operate camps with measured discipline? How could soldiers who had fought in battles of extreme violence now kneel to treat civilian wounds? For some Japanese, this contradiction never resolved. The memory of devastation remained dominant. For others, the daily experience of structured occupation gradually redefined perception. History rarely offers moral clarity instead. It presents human systems operating under immense pressure, capable of both devastation and restraint. And in the late summer of 1945, as civilians moved cautiously within the perimeters of American camps, these contradictions converged into a single decisive reality. The moment when fear finally met sustained exposure and something irreversible began to
change. April 1st, 1945. Easter.
Sunday, American forces land on Okinawa in the Abash, largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. More than 180,000 U.S. troops move ashore. In the opening phase, naval guns thunder from offshore battleships. Aircraft circle overhead. The campaign that follows will last 82 days. For Okinawan civilians, it becomes the most traumatic chapter of the war, as fighting intensifies in the south. Tens of thousands of civilians are trapped between Japanese defensive lines and advancing American forces. Many hide in caves. Some are pressed into service as laborers. Others are caught in crossfire. Japanese soldiers warn them of American atrocities. Rumors spread rapidly: rape, torture, execution. When American units begin establishing civilian collection points in late April and May 1945, the first encounters are tense. Marines and Army troops advance cautiously toward cave entrances, often accompanied by interpreters and loudspeaker teams. They call out in Japanese instructions to surrender, promises of safety. Leaflets had carried similar messages weeks earlier. Now those words are repeated in person. Some civilians refuse to emerge. Others come out slowly, hands raised, faces hollow with exhaustion. The first hours are critical. At these collection points, procedure replaces chaos. Civilians are searched for weapons. Families are grouped together. The wounded are separated for treatment. Medical corpsmen apply sulfa powder to infected wounds. Field surgeons operate in canvas tents only meters away from artillery positions. Water is distributed. Food follows by May 1945. Large civilian camps begin forming under American supervision in relatively secure areas of the island. Estimates suggest that by the end of the battle, over 300,000 Okinawan civilians had passed through or been housed in such camps. Conditions were crowded. Supplies were strained. Disease outbreaks occurred, but systematic massacres, the horror civilians had been told to expect, did not materialize. Eyewitness accounts from Okinawan survivors describe the moment of realization, not as sudden relief, but as gradual disbelief. American guards stood watch but did not assault detainees. Children received vaccinations. Doctors treated both civilians and captured Japanese soldiers. The contrast was visible. Inside the caves, starvation and fear had defined survival. Inside the camps, order, however fragile, defined daily life. The battle itself remained brutal. On June 22, 1945, organized Japanese resistance effectively ended. More than 12,000 American troops had been killed. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000. Civilian casualties were catastrophic, but within the civilian camps, something unprecedented was unfolding. For many Okinawans, this was the first sustained interaction with Americans that did not involve gunfire. The enemy now wore surgical gloves. The devils operated water pumps, and word began to spread beyond the island, because Okinawa was not the end of the war. It was the preview of what mainland Japan might face. By August 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, surrender was no longer hypothetical. American occupation forces were preparing to land on the home islands themselves, and millions of civilians waited uncertain whether the structured restraint seen on Okinawa would hold, or whether something darker would follow. August 30th, 1945. The first American transport planes land at Otsugi Airfield near Tokyo. Within days, occupation forces begin moving into the capital. The formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay will take place on September 2nd, but on the ground, the transition has already begun. Tokyo is a city of ash. The March firebombing had erased vast districts. Charred foundations stretch block after block. Railway lines are twisted. Factories stand hollowed out. Civilians move through rubble and worn clothing, ration cards tucked carefully into pockets. Into this landscape arrive organized columns of American troops. Jeeps roll past burned tram lines. Military police establish checkpoints. Engineers assess bridges and roads. Communication units install radio systems. Headquarters staff prepare offices for General Douglas MacArthur, who will soon direct occupation policy from the Daiichi building. Overlooking the Imperial Palace, there is no chaotic looting, no indiscriminate shootings. Japanese police remain on duty under supervision. Public order is maintained through a combination of American oversight and existing local structures. Curfews are announced. Rules are posted. Civilians watch from sidewalks and shattered doorways. For weeks, many expect violence to erupt. Women reportedly cut their hair short to appear less noticeable. Some families prepare suicide plans, recalling stories from Saipan and Okinawa. Others hide valuables in case of confiscation. But the violence does not come. Instead, what spreads through Tokyo in September 1945 is something quieter: observation. American soldiers patrol in pairs. They carry weapons, but they also carry cameras. Some take photographs of ruins. Others exchange cigarettes for small crafts or souvenirs. Black markets form near occupation zones, where canned goods and cigarettes become powerful currency. Food relief becomes one of the occupation's most urgent tasks. By late 1945, Japan faces severe shortages. Crop yields are down. Transportation networks are crippled. The winter threatens famine. American authorities authorize shipments of grain and other supplies to stabilize urban populations. Distribution centers are organized. Lines form the same logistical discipline seen on Pacific Islands now appears in the heart of Japan's capital. Warehouses store imported wheat. Trucks deliver rations to municipal points. Medical teams monitor disease outbreaks. Japanese. Civilians entering or observing these facilities encounter the same patterns seen earlier on Okinawa. Inventory lists, sanitation procedures, orderly queues. The shock deepens, because now the contrast is not between rumor and isolated experience. It is between years of state narrative and daily, lived reality in the nation's own. Capital. Occupation policies extend beyond food. Press censorship shifts direction. Political prisoners are released. Militarist leaders are arrested. Schools begin revising curricula. Women are granted voting rights in 1945. Labor unions emerge under new regulations. These reforms unfold under the visible presence of American camps and headquarters centers of power that function with methodical efficiency. There are incidents. There are tensions. There are crimes investigated and prosecuted under military law. But the systemic collapse into barbarism, predicted by wartime, propaganda never materializes. By autumn 1945, many Japanese civilians have seen enough to understand that the occupation is not annihilation, it is transformation. And that realization, more than any single battle, marks the true turning point. Because when fear dissolves at a national scale, something deeper begins to shift. Not surrender, not victory, but perception. And from that shift flows everything that follows. The war ended in September 1945, but survival did not become easier. Overnight, Japan faced a humanitarian crisis of staggering scale. Industrial production had collapsed. An estimated 66 cities had suffered heavy bombing. Transportation networks were fractured. Merchant shipping lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Millions of demobilized soldiers began returning from former imperial territories China, Korea, Southeast Asia, adding strain to already fragile food supplies. The coming winter loomed with quiet menace. American occupation authorities quickly recognized the danger. Without immediate stabilization, famine and unrest could spread across urban centers. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers SCAP, prioritized food distribution as a cornerstone of occupation policy. Shipments began arriving by late 1945 and into 1946. Millions of tons of food were imported into Japan, primarily wheat and other grains. These supplies did not erase hunger, but they prevented catastrophic starvation in major cities. Distribution systems were reorganized. Municipal authorities worked alongside occupation officials to manage ration cards and delivery schedules. Civilians who had once expected massacre now lined up for American-provided grain. The camps remained central nodes in this system. Warehouses stored incoming shipments. Military trucks delivered food to distribution centers. Medical officers tracked malnutrition rates. Public health campaigns addressed outbreaks of tuberculosis and dysentery, diseases that had spread rapidly during the final months of war. For many Japanese civilians, the shock of American camps in 1945 gradually transformed into routine interaction by 1946. Yet, this new reality was not simple gratitude. Resentment persisted. The memory of firebombed neighborhoods did not fade. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained raw wounds. Occupation, censorship restricted certain expressions of criticism. Political authority had shifted dramatically. The emperor, once presented as divine, publicly renounced that status in January 1946. Society was being restructured at its core. The American presence was visible everywhere in administrative buildings. Airfields, ports, military police patrolled key areas. Black markets thrived despite official efforts to regulate trade. Cigarettes and canned goods became informal currency. Economic hardship pushed many into barter systems that operated beyond ration cards. Occupation policy walked a narrow line. Too harsh, and unrest would follow. Too lenient, and control would erode. For civilians, daily life involved negotiation between pride and pragmatism, between memory and necessity. Families rebuilt homes from salvaged wood, Schools reopened under revised curricula, emphasizing democracy rather than imperial doctrine. Newspapers cautiously tested new freedoms within censorship boundaries. The American camp, once a symbol of shock, became part of the urban landscape. Children who had first stared in disbelief at jeeps and generators now passed them on their way to school. Farmers exchanged goods with occupation personnel. Interpreters found steady employment. Cultural contact, careful, limited, but persistent, began to reshape assumptions on both sides. The transformation was not dramatic. It was incremental. And beneath the surface of food shipments and administrative reform, something quieter was taking root, a long-term shift in how the former enemy was perceived. By 1946, the American camp was no longer a spectacle. It was a fixture. Across Japan, from Tokyo to Yokohama, from Sasaba to Osaka, occupation facilities operated with structured regularity. Airfields buzzed with transport aircraft. Warehouses processed shipments. Military police maintained checkpoints. Civil affairs officers coordinated with Japanese ministries now, functioning under Allied supervision. But something more significant than logistics was unfolding. The psychological distance between conqueror and conquered was narrowing for millions of Japanese civilians. The image of the American enemy had been constructed carefully over years of war. It had been reinforced by bombing raids, by battlefield stories, by cultural isolation. That image did not vanish overnight. Yet daily exposure eroded its certainty. Children were often the first to adapt. They approached soldiers out of curiosity rather than fear. English words entered playground vocabulary. American comic strips and magazines, when available, circulated quietly. Baseball games organized between occupation personnel and locals became small. Spectacles of normalcy in a country that had known only mobilization and sacrifice. Adults were more cautious. Many carried layered emotions relief. That violence had ended, bitterness at defeat, suspicion of foreign authority. Yet practical realities dominated. Food shipments continued. Infrastructure repairs expanded. Railways were restored. Factories reopened under revised management structures. Economic recovery, though slow and uneven, began. Political transformation accelerated. In 1947, Japan adopted a new constitution under occupation guidance. It renounced war as a sovereign right. It established parliamentary democracy. Women voted for the first time in national elections. Land reform programs redistributed property from large landlords to tenant farmers, altering rural power dynamics. These changes were not universally embraced. Debate persisted. National identity was recalibrated. But the foundation had shifted permanently within this context. Memories of 1945 camps acquired new meaning. For some civilians, those first encounters, food handed across a table, medical care administered without humiliation, became the moment when fear cracked. For others, it was simply the beginning of a complicated coexistence. But in both cases, the experience contradicted the absolute narratives that had defined wartime psychology. Historians examining post-war diaries and testimonies often note a recurring theme: surprise. Not at kindness alone, but at order, at discipline, at the absence of the chaos they had been conditioned to expect. That surprise did not erase the devastation of Tokyo's firebombing. It did not erase Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It did not erase personal loss, but it altered the frame. The enemy was no longer a mythic monster. It was a structured state actor capable of destruction, yet also capable of administration and restraint. Over time, that distinction mattered. By 1952, the formal occupation ended. Japan regained sovereignty under the San Francisco Peace Treaty. American military presence remained in certain bases, but political authority returned fully to Japanese control. Camps of 1945 gradually dissolved into history, yet their psychological impact endured, because in the late summer and autumn of 1945, Inside, rows of olive drab tents and humming generators. Something more than surrender had occurred. A narrative had collapsed. And in its place, a more complicated reality had emerged, one that would shape Japanese-American relations for decades to come. In war, nations fight with weapons, but they also fight with stories. For years, Japanese civilians were told that the American soldier was a monster. That capture meant extinction. That surrender meant dishonor beyond recovery. Those stories were reinforced by firebombed cities, by battlefield tragedies, by the unbearable shock of atomic light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Fear had been engineered, and fear had worked. But in 1945, inside the ordered geometry of American military camps, another reality stood waiting. Generators hummed. Water pumps operated. Medics dressed wounds. Rations were counted and distributed with bureaucratic precision. Guards enforced rules, not vengeance. The shock Japanese civilians felt was not simply relief. It was disorientation, because when lived experience contradicts absolute belief, something inside a society shifts. The enemy becomes human. The myth fractures. And from that fracture, a different future becomes possible. This does not erase destruction. It does not simplify morality. The same nation that organized food relief had incinerated cities. The same army that offered chocolate to children had fought with ruthless intensity across the Pacific. History rarely offers clean lines. But in the late summer of 1945, millions of Japanese civilians encountered a truth that propaganda could not contain that power. Even when victorious, could choose structure over chaos. And in that choice lay the quiet beginning of post-war. Japan, not born from trust, not born from forgiveness, but born from the moment. Fear met reality and did not find what it expected.